Welcome, everybody, to our next episode of ThreatCon 1, the place to be to talk about emerging threats with the people who matter. Patrick, how you doing, my man?
What's up? Happy New Year.
Happy New Year. We can still say that, I think, apparently, according to Larry David on Curb Your Enthusiasm, until like January 10th, and then it times out. It's not cool anymore.
Yeah, I went to the gym yesterday and someone was wearing a Christmas shirt and I was like, hey, you can't wear the Christmas shirt anymore.
Yeah, that has to go. Well, I'm super pumped today. We've got our friends from Zafran on the call. Like, our listeners are going to be like totally psyched to listen to some of the use cases and some of the experiences that both Nate and Yonatan have. So, hey, listen, I'll let you guys introduce yourselves. We're happy to have you here today.
Awesome. Glad to be here. Yeah, so I'm Nate Rawlings. I'm the CISO at Zafran. You know, I make the joke. Maybe this is the old guy in me, but if you remember the Hair Club for Men commercials, where it's good coming from me too, but where I'm not only the CISO, I'm also a former customer of Zafran. So similar to the Hair Club for Men, like I'm not only the president, but I'm also a member.
I believe his name was Cy Sperling.
Wow, you're in, Tom. Now I'm suspicious if you were a member.
I mean, I'm old. And Yonatan Keller.
Yeah, so pleased to be here with you. I'm Yonatan. I'm actually a military veteran. I spent 2 decades in the IDF, mostly in the intelligence corps, and then something like 5 years in the Cyber Defense Directorate. And then I moved to Zafran. I've been almost 3 years in Zafran, so I remember Zafran at its very early days.
Well, we have so many things and so many directions to go in today, and like so many things to discuss, but thank you guys for joining us today. I don't know, Patrick, I mean, it's probably interesting to just kind of hear what both, we've got 2 very diverse backgrounds with Nate and Yonatan. Maybe you guys could give us a little bit of like, you know, an idea of some cool things you're working on, and then we'll get into some of the experiences that you had in cyber.
Yeah, go ahead, Yonatan. You're doing cooler stuff than I am.
Well, I'm not sure. I'm leading the analysis team and the whole threat intelligence side of Zafran. My first goal is to research security controls and to be able to understand to what extent security controls can be an EDR, can be a firewall, can be a segmentation product, can be a cloud security product, whatever you have, whatever you can imagine, to understand to what extent can they meet vulnerability mitigation. So how can we match security controls which have not necessarily been formed in order to tackle vulnerabilities and make them efficient in order to mitigate different families of vulnerabilities. My second goal is to be the threat intelligence guy of Zafran, to understand how can we enrich and incorporate a threat intelligence picture inside this CTEM platform. So when I want to prioritize my vulnerabilities or to mobilize my different kind of security controls against these vulnerabilities, I also have the full threat picture of it.
Ooh, we got to talk about mitigations and vulnerabilities. That's going to be a fun topic.
That's our jam. So for me, I take more of the practitioner approach here. Like I'm helping our customers not only understand Zafran and the technology and what we're doing, but how do you enable the folks on your team, so the people portion of it, so that they can adapt to the way that the industry is moving, utilize CTEM most effectively, and build the processes to operationalize this, right? We all hate shelfware, and nobody hates that more than Zafran. We want to be a part of your day-to-day so that you're responding to exposures quickly, mitigating those as Yonatan works on so diligently to close that exposure window. So how do we take you there, right? We see this as a maturity journey, whether you're scanning, just doing basic detection and reporting on vulnerabilities. We want to take you to rapid response, investigation, and automating a lot of your processes. So I take that very seriously because, you know, our founders, us as a company, we're very committed to making the industry better at managing and responding to vulnerabilities.
Can I hop in and ask a few questions on those topics? Because like I know we didn't plan to talk about those things, so I'm like, oh man, I want to go there. So Yeah, I think the first one, Yonatan, like you talk about mitigating controls and vulnerability exposures, right? And what I'm curious to hear from your perspective, like for those listening, can you provide some examples of like a vulnerability and where a mitigating control might be sufficient opposed to patching the vulnerability?
So yeah, so the whole idea of mitigating vulnerabilities is that, patching a vulnerability can take a lot of time. At least if I believe the latest Verizon report, it takes in average for a corporate organization in the US 49 days to patch a vulnerability. And of course, during this period of time, the attackers are not waiting there. You are fully exposed to different attacks. So the whole idea is how to leverage your security controls that you already bought for kind of a lot of hundreds of thousands of dollars, maybe more, and make them efficient in far more shorter and simpler actions to meet these vulnerabilities.
And that's where your agentic approach is starting to really help customers.
Exactly. But even before the agentic approach, and I'm sure that we're going to elaborate about that soon, the idea that, for example, you can just configure your firewall policies in the right way to deal with this or that categories of vulnerabilities. You can just put this or that feature of your EDR to activate it and reduce the risk that an actual attackers can exploit this vulnerability against you on a specific asset, on a specific component. So this is the whole idea.
So a lot of times are what you're saying is like the default configurations might not implement those capabilities. So the mitigation might exist, but it's not enabled.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And some controls have no default configurations. You have to configure the control yourself.
Yeah.
And sometimes it's straightforward. So for example, if you take firewalls, many firewalls have this kind of CVE specific rules, So you have a specific rule for log4j. You want to mitigate log4j, you just have to activate or to make sure that this rule is activated. Sometimes it's far more complicated and requires some analysis and some heuristic approach to understand how a general feature can help to mitigate some of the vulnerabilities that your system have.
I have a wild question. Like, do you have any idea on of vulnerabilities in an enterprise environment? Like, what's the percentage of those that actually have or could have a mitigating control in place? Any idea? Have you ever looked at that type of analysis?
So I don't remember the exact numbers. It really depends on your environment and on the kind of vulnerabilities that we are talking about. Some products are better than others. Some products are more vulnerable than others.
Yeah.
But we do believe that the portion of mitigable vulnerabilities is not that small, and that you can effectively configure your security controls in the right way in order not necessarily to reduce to zero, but at least to reduce at some point the risk of exploitation.
Yonatan, he's trying to be politically correct with you too, Patrick, because there's tools that he really likes and doesn't like. So you'll have to ask him offline there.
I think everyone would love to hear that. And I get what you're saying, right? For those, when we're talking about mitigating controls, like different firewalls have different rule sets, right? Is a good example of like a mitigating control, and that's going to mitigate usually network type attacks. Whereas like an EDR is going to be more oriented on your endpoint, and they'll have different rule sets as well and different capabilities depending on what product that you buy.
One thing that I think our customers like is probably an unintended value point is so mitigations is clearly built into the fabric of what we do. So we not only want to tell you what mitigations deploy, we want to consider what mitigations are deployed and how you're prioritizing vulnerabilities. But one of the things that CISO specifically love is you can see what value, what risk reduction you're getting from currently deployed mitigations. And when Yonatan just talked about some of the most expensive tools in your security stack, so your firewall, your next generation firewalls, right? Your WAF, your EDR, like, why am I paying so much for these? Well, if I can see that they're mitigating this much risk across this many assets, addressing this many vulnerabilities, defending against exploitation, it's much easier for a security team to articulate the value they're getting from the cost of those expensive tools. And right, that's just a really great data point and supports total cost of ownership.
Yeah, I think this is also a one of the challenges too. I think to some extent is in some areas of detection, it's benefited the legacy vendors because they built detections over such long time, which actually I think could be misleading in some ways, in some cases, because they might not be the quickest, fastest, or best for newer technologies. And I think there's been a lot of new companies that are covering different areas doing that, but maybe don't have as complete coverage because of the legacy long tail of doing detection engineering over a long period of time.
To that point, Patrick, it's like the job of an enterprise cyber team gets actually harder because of that, because there's so many different tools that you have to evaluate and assess all the time across, the IR team, the VM team, CTI team, red team, SecOps, AppSec, right? It's hard to find like best of breed stuff that's going to work to give you like to cut that time to result for your customers. And I think it's like there's kind of too many security tools out there. It's kind of like the way that we look at it. Like the industry does not have a tools problem, it's got a data problem, but it's manifested itself from tools.
Yeah, I don't say quite a data problem, it's interoperability problem, right? And it's on two things. So the tools working together, which that's what we try to bring, is that centralized visibility. But then you think of the constructs in place that make this challenging. You, Tom, just laid some of those out. So my AppSec team might run the WAF. Then I've got an endpoint security team that runs the EDR. I've got a network security team that runs a firewall. Having done this, like, I'm knocking on the door of the network security team, like, hey, can you put this IPS rule in? So while we wait for my counterparts in IT to remediate this vulnerability, and they don't necessarily feel the impetus to do that right away. Right? Well, I got a bunch of firewall change tickets. Yeah, we'll try to get to that, but why is it necessary? Well, one of the things when we talk about enabling people to have to create that connective tissue between those segmented organizations is by giving them all of the details associated with the vulnerability, available mitigations, the risk, the threat, thank you, Bain check, that is present. It really drives them like, okay, we understand the risk. We've got all the receipts, as I like to say. This is really important. Let's prioritize this in our work as well.
Right. That's interesting. Well, even just like shifting gears a little bit from this, and it's still on topic, but like, Nate, you have an interesting background because you've run security at multiple companies. Most notably, you've spent a long time in the healthcare sector too, right? Like you were working on a number of different things to try to mitigate threats, to reduce risk. How does your background, how does that time that you spent in healthcare sort of like transfer into what you're doing today at Zafran?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I think there's a lot. So first of all, I think having worked in a highly regulated organization like that, understanding not only the regulations that apply to these organizations, whether it be in healthcare, financial services, critical sectors, is important. How do we support managing compliance with addressing the real risks?
Mm-hmm.
But it's actually, the value I feel like for me, not here at Zafran, to provide to the product team, but also helping customers is, all right, what are those organizational barriers that keep us from responding to vulnerabilities that are being actively exploited in similar environments in the right way? Like, how can we address those with our capabilities? And if we can't address those, how can we work with customers to think about those things differently? Because, we were talking about this the other day, is that all we're doing with our agentic capabilities to automate processes, many of those processes are still the same things, right? Like the processes that haven't changed in vulnerability management and continuous threat exposure management for 20 years, right? I'm still looking for false positives. I'm still communicating vulnerabilities and helping developers troubleshoot, right? Those things are the same. How can we think about those differently Or how can we do them better? Can we automate those and build trust that by automating them, we're doing them effectively in the same way that you would have otherwise done them manually or better?
And then I think, Yonatan, you also come from a totally different background than Nate does to bring your experience into Zafran too. So you spent a ton of time in your career in IDF, working within the military, J6, like as a threat intelligence analyst and a couple of other roles too. How does that translate into what you guys are also doing today as Zafran? Because that's like your point in time, like speed matters, right? When you're defending national security. There's a lot there that we could unpack, but give us an idea of how that kind of like transfers into what you're doing for customers today.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think there are tons of difference, of course, between a military organization and a cybersecurity vendor, and not only talking about income. Of course, intelligence organizations will have something that cybersecurity vendors will never have, which is both national intelligence sources, very powerful, and I, of course, won't expand on the nature of these sources, and a legal framework allowing you to be far more like proactive or offensive towards the attacker that who attacks you. I think another difference maybe is that, to my sense, the military tends to give maybe more weight to threat intelligence. Like when you are targeted as a country, the whole idea is not to block the intrusion, but to develop deep knowledge about the bad guys who are attacking you, both their intentions and capabilities, and to develop the right and really strictly tailored response strategies. And of course, like this kind of cyber interactions with the attackers are also going far beyond cybersecurity per se. They have like different kinds of diplomatic, economic, whatever military implications. And I think that like your response strategies, they may be defensive or offensive, but they have to be very like specific and tailored to the threat that you are dealing with. When I moved to Zafran, to a cybersecurity vendor, I realized how different is the mindset in the cybersecurity industry. It looks to me that the industry prefers the blue side over the red side. Like the whole business is less about tracking this or that APT, but much more about building like very strong defense lines that would make harder for any attacker around the world to be able to penetrate your environment. So the goal is not necessarily to understand who is coming after you, but to make your environment far more like resilient. So it doesn't mean that threat intelligence has no parts in the cybersecurity sector, of course, but it means that it's only a component, maybe an important component, but a component of a defense-centric approach, kind of.
Is there a certain category that you guys are starting to see on the Zafran side? Is there like a specific category of threat that you're seeing that you're particularly concerned about? Or is there like one like big uber threat that you guys are looking at and going, okay, like this, either A, it is a huge problem for companies today, or like, is there something in the future that you're looking at where it's like, this might be a problem today, but like 2 years from now, like this is going to emerge as something like significant that enterprise teams are going to need to contend with?
So we're looking at, of course, any threat, or at least any threat connected to vulnerabilities. And this is a very large question. I can think of different kind of emerging threats. But I think that we are currently like witnessing two very concerning trends. First, the barriers to entry the exploitation market or the hacking market have totally dropped, partly thanks to these like Gen AI tools. And on the other hand, the impact of these attacks have become far more severe than it has been earlier. So it's not only that the attacks are becoming more frequent, they're also becoming more disruptive and destructive. And for a long time, the whole industry was very focused on these like highly organized, highly sophisticated APTs. And we were a bit looking down at these like lone wolves, activists, opportunistic groups, teenage hackers, this kind of stuff. But I think that things have changed. So take, for example, like Dragon Force, one of the most prominent ransomware cartels that just incorporated part of the late ransomware groups. But 3 or 4 years ago, these guys were just a bunch of Malaysian activists. Take another, maybe more famous example of Scatter Spider. Maybe the most talked about group these days, making a lot of troubles to many different kind of industries. So far, they have arrested 5 group members. Their age ranged from 17 to 22. So basically, just a bunch of teenagers, right? And we're talking about a group that recently attacked a very iconic brand, Jaguar Land Rover, the car manufacturer. The attack cost them billions, and they were very close to be out of business because of these attacks from a bunch of teenagers. So I think that we should be more concerned than we are about the possibility, the eventuality of this kind of like individual hackers quickly organizing from different parts of the globe and quickly launching very efficient, very disruptive operations again large corporate organizations.
Yeah, I think that's the threat, enablement.
I mean, it's good to look at it that way. I haven't heard other people framing it similarly. The barrier being dropped and the impact being more severe. And yeah, I mean, we've always talked about script kiddies, but like now it's corporate destruction at very large scale. And it's a very small group of people typically in these groups. It's not a highly sophisticated nation state that's necessarily behind it in many of these cases.
What's interesting about what you just said, Yonatan, is like it's not about who, right? Like it's important, and you need to know like different TTPs. You need to understand all of those attributes of a particular threat actor, right? Whether it's nation state backed or it's they're independent actors, but boy, like there's a lot to unpack when you're looking at that low barrier where like anybody can just go cherry pick some vulnerability and go, oh, all right, well, I'm just going to build I'm going to use AI to build a quick exploit POC. It may or may not be very good because I've used AI to create that, but I've done it quickly. I didn't have to do a ton of work, and guess what? I've got exploitation happening pretty quickly because it's just some random vulnerability that I pulled off some vendor advisory, right? Like it's almost too easy now. And yet there's still so few vulnerabilities that are actually that exist in the critical category. Like, are we going to see an increase in that critical category, do we think, this year, now that we've turned into 2026?
That's a good question. So far, the number of 2025 show a reduction of critical and high severity vulnerabilities, but it may be part of like changes the way that you collect and report your data. I think that all this like criticality debate has to be like a bit reshaped, and this is the kind of stuff that we are trying to do in Zafran. We have tons of examples where we see customers panicking about this new critical vulnerability that everybody is talking about. And then when you look at the details, you understand that first, the asset is not necessarily internet facing. The vulnerability has not been spotted in runtime, not been loaded in the memory. And second, maybe they have like different kind of protections of security controls or firewalls or EDRs or whatever that already protecting this asset against this type of vulnerability. So you don't have any reason to actually panic, and you should patch the things, not necessarily the critical, but the things that are posing a real threat to your environment.
We did some research last year on this, Yonatan did, and it was, I think we said 1 in 50,000 vulnerabilities is actually critical when you consider all the data points, like you mentioned, internet reachability, runtime, existence of security controls. And when you see that, it's like, oh, what are we so concerned about? Well, the fact is that people don't generally have the telemetry or visibility into those ones that actually matter, which is almost more concerning, right? Because you know that they're out there, you know that they can be really impactful and destructive, as we've mentioned, but I can't identify them necessarily, or I'm responding to other ones that are not as critical, wasting my resources and losing precious time while that exposure window's shortening. So while we may not have more criticals, it's the impact of the criticals and the time in which they're being exploited is decreasing significantly.
Yeah. Hey, well, I'm looking. It's funny. I'm doing the research on our 2025 KEB stuff. Like don't exploited vulnerabilities, and yeah, I mean similar trends. It's like network edge devices are number one. I think that the challenge with network edge devices is there's like no mitigating control. It's on the internet, and most of those products you're looking at are legacy products that, in some cases, haven't been well maintained for decades. And I continue to point this out in the industry. I think my joke, and I will talk openly about vendors. I was like, hey, yeah, I've made a LinkedIn post this week. It's like, all right, we're going to start the year with Citrix, Avanti, or Fortinet. Like that's the reality we're in, and I think it's the aspect of like all three of those products have been held by multiple hands over time. Likely, maybe not all of them, but like they're going on 30 years old. Like the software hasn't been rewritten. Yeah, maybe there's been some improvements, some updates, things like that. But naturally, I think there's a real reality too that like the thing we're putting on the edge, like, yeah, it's reliable, but we continue to see exposures and there's no perfect software. But yeah, generally the bulk of things, it's like CMS, open source software. Like these are things that are very highly exposed. Server software, you're at, people end up putting SAP and Oracle and other fun systems, SharePoint on the internet.
And lots of those edge devices, Patrick, are open source compiled, right? Like I think I saw some stat that was like over 80% of edge devices are actually all OS software. So there's not a lot of proprietary software.
Yeah,
Like,
I mean, yeah, everyone nowadays is incorporating open source into products they're building without question. I mean, there's very little proprietary code only products that aren't dependent on open source software. So yeah, but I think that just highlights what you guys are seeing and saying, which is it is a challenge of needles in the haystack, dependent and unique to the technology that you're looking at, and how it's impacted. And yeah, certainly when you get into open source software and developing your own software, that gets into even more needles in the haystack of what dependencies, what is actually exposed, is the service running or operational, and can it actually be exploited? And that the AppSec side, I think, is, yeah, I mean, from what I've seen, it's a whole nother beast because of those complications and dependencies and how you're writing software and whether it's reachable and all of those different scenarios. And then what's the actual impact, right? Like if I get to leverage and use this vulnerability, can I reach other things? Do I have access to data or other information? Like, yeah, it gets hairy.
it certainly makes it like Nate, I'd be curious on your perspective on this, only because like I think about like medical devices and I think about devices that are used in the healthcare industry. It also makes me like really scared about like the OT world as well too, where you've got critical infrastructure and like, companies that are manufacturing connected devices, but also organizations who are using those connected devices for mission critical things like patient health, maintaining uptime of like our power grid, our water grid, things like that. All of those substations for any power company, like, probably to Patrick's point, haven't been updated or patched in a very long time, right? I mean, there's probably some reliance on the vendor for that. There's probably some reliance on the cyber team internally for that. But boy, it gives you sort of like the chills thinking about those connected devices, how that could be like just a very easy entry point, and just a very easy exploit for anybody. And once they're in, and now they're on your network.
Yeah, you did a nice job of kind of laying out some of the risks there. Like some of these things just can't be patched, or I have to replace the motherboard to upgrade it, or those things. I mean, like I know we're beating the mitigation drum, but this just highlights the importance of mitigations and those. If I can't bring it down to patch it, or I'm unwilling to patch it, like what other things can I do in my environment to not only understand the risk relative to those, and some of those is patient safety, which is should be above all risk, but what can I do to further mitigate it? So I think certainly, again, goes back to understanding what controls I can deploy in lieu of patching, if we're not going to suddenly become really good at patching those types of devices or systems, and then having the visibility to understand the ones that I need to focus on. Because, when we talk to folks in manufacturing, they're not necessarily dealing with the data security concerns. They don't have the same level of risk universe or threat lexicon as more regulated organizations generally do. And they're focused on making widgets, uptime, right? Making sure that things keep going. So they don't have time. They don't have downtime for patching. They're certainly not patching during production. So that's where they're thinking about what are the minimally viable controls or patches that are necessary. And if I can give them
I live in the Motor City, and I live with the security folks, and they're always like, hey, here's my biggest problem. The manufacturing floor cannot shut down except at 2 weeks after Christmas, or like the week before Christmas, and that's the only time I have to update systems all year round. Right. And because the plants are running 24/7, and they literally are like, dude, the plant operator told me we will lose $100 million a day if this plant doesn't continue operating at 24/7. So if my SAP update to patch a vulnerability that could hypothetically have a security impact that's internal causes an outage, that's on me. And, that's on the plant operator.
Right.
And I think that's the real, realities that people often overlook that are in vuln management roles, is they don't have the business context to understand that, like, hey, you can't just patch everything immediately. Like, there are real business aspects. So although I think a lot of us on the threat side are always like, just patch the thing, get it out there, like, they miss the context of the cost of the business and the risk of actually doing that. So yeah, I agree with you. Mitigating controls are important.
So at Zafran, you guys are doing some interesting things around your agentic approach, helping your customers really go and figure out what they should prioritize, what's critical, what they can wait on. Give us an idea of kind of like, maybe one thing would be interesting, like, how are you guys using intelligence to to drive that agentic approach? Because we're starting to see a lot of use cases on our side of VulnCheck where it's like, it's not just about using AI to detect. It's about using AI to make things quicker. But there always has to be data, and there has to be intel on the back end to be able to do that and to process things like in a way where not only is it quick, but it's accurate for customers.
Yeah, like for me, the wow moment was when we introduced our zero-day agents, because like zero-day situations is something like crazy. Like you hear the news about a new exploited in the wild zero-day. There is no CVID. You know very little about this vulnerability, and you start panicking. And everybody around you is basically telling you to wait. You have to wait for CVE to be assigned. Then you have to wait for threat information to flow in. Then you have to wait for your vulnerability scanner to release the right detections, right? You can't spot the zero-day in your environment until your scanners is not adapted. And then you have to wait for your EPS or your EDR to have the right protections and the right signatures against this zero-day. And finally, you have to wait for a patch. So it is your weakest moment. You have to act very quickly, and you understand that the threat is here and you want to protect your organization, but then you have to wait for all of these things to happen. And then I think it was around the WSUS zero day a few weeks ago, and we showed our customer how to do that in a matter of seconds. So there was very little information about this, the exploitation of this vulnerability. And then you just have to query your agent. And really, in a matter of seconds, you have first full vulnerability assessment of the zero day, a full threat picture, at least to the point that we understand who are the threat actors and what are their modus operandi and what kind of other vulnerabilities they are using, and to what extent before this 0 day they are already posing a threat to your environment. And then you run an SBOM analysis to identify exactly which assets in your environment are potentially impacted by this 0 day, even before you have a CVID for it. And finally, the agent is offering you, suggesting different kind of mitigation strategies that you can apply in order to strengthen your defenses against this 0 day. So the whole process just takes seconds, maybe a bit exaggerated, but a few minutes rather than a few days that you have to wait for all the ecosystem to be aligned.
Yeah, I'll double in on that one. That he stole mine. I will use the React to shell. Like that was when we really introduced this to the world, put it out there on LinkedIn. I mean, before all the detections were available, we were helping our customers identify instances of that vulnerability and mitigations that they could deploy. So to me, that's extra powerful, because when you think about the exposure window and that, like, we've got like a failure to launch problem, and security is like, well, I run a scan on nights and weekends. Like, well, so you're only understanding exposure from the point in which you detect the vulnerability, not at the point in which you're impacted by that vulnerability. And if we can help them speed that up for the most critical exposures, then we can give them a leg up in terms of reducing their exposure window within the organization. I think this is the type of things we needed to be doing to think differently about detecting a vulnerability. Like, I know for me, and the people that will work for me are going to lament this comment, but that was always my thing. It was like, we're not susceptible to a vulnerability from when we detected it. We're susceptible to when it was first identified or that software was first installed. And we got to understand from that point, not just when we're running vulnerabilities. The long held trick for people in managing compliance with vulnerabilities is, just scan less frequently, right? Because it'll give me more time to address those, and I won't identify them as quickly. But now that the risk this has become a top attack vector, according to M-Trends and Mandiant, and I think it's rising. It's number 2 from a DBIR perspective behind credentials. Is like, the risk is real. This is leading to ransomware and impacting the organization and our ability to generate revenue. Okay, let's get serious about addressing the risk and not just playing the check the box compliance game. And that's solving a real problem, which is what we're passionate about.
It's pretty wild. Like when you say the word ransomware, it's like anytime that word is in something, it's like you should probably care about it. Like, from an impact perspective. And I think you just mentioned DVR. It's like, what does a DVR have to do with ransomware?
Right. So like that's one of the things Yonatan, has put into the platform, is that we categorize based on data we get from VulnCheck and the research that we do, if it's associated with a ransomware gang, right? That way you can focus on the vulnerabilities that are most impactful for you. So if I'm in, manufacturing, I'm working at one of the big 4, Patrick, and I only going to focus on certain vulnerabilities, and I really care about ransomware because that's a large enterprise risk for us. Let me identify those vulnerabilities and address those or mitigate those first, right?
Yeah, well, like, kind of putting a bow on the discussion, is there something that exists out there, or something that you guys have seen, some type of threat that is just like, it's either like the most perplexing, all threats are bad, but like, is there something that is an issue today, but it's definitely going to be an issue down the road that you guys are sort of preparing for, try to future-proof your customers on not being caught with your pants down, as they say, to be able to mitigate something that, like, it's coming?
I guess I'll tease. It's vulnerabilities with AI, right, Yonatan? Like, we're doing a ton of work around that right now. It's like, I think what we're seeing is it's more pervasive than people actually understand. So
I'm starting to see some trends that there's a lot more coming.
About like AI vulnerabilities, I think that the whole ecosystem there is no something similar to the CVE program for AI vulnerabilities. So no normalization, no serial numbers that the whole industry can be aligned with. And I think it's kind of a matter of concern. So I remember, like, was maybe like 6 months ago, something like that, when the large breach of Drift AI happened. I'm sure that you remember that. So Drift AI basically is just chatbot, right? It's a automation platform used for like sales and customer engagement. And since it's like deeply integrated with many other platforms and enterprise software, so the breach of this Drift AI has resulted in full and very wide supply chain attack, compromising tons of Salesforce accounts of major like tech companies. And no CVID has been assigned to that. So nobody is able to track actually the vulnerabilities within Drift AI or any other, almost any other AI libraries. What we did is to try to very quickly establish the list of the most popular AI libraries used in large companies, and then to release a very quick and small tracker tool running as bomb analysis and showing you where are you exposed. But it's a partial tool. If you don't,
is that internal or is that public?
Internal.
Okay, no, that's fine. I was just curious. Like I want to go click around. Yeah, I agree with what you're saying, and you know, the evolution of things like CVE and how slow things change. You know, there's not even much reaction or reactivity in that program, and so yeah, I'm kind of curious to see if industry evolves something or something else comes about in relation to AI vulnerabilities, because frankly, there isn't a good answer today. It's also very early on. I know adoption is so fast. And I think that's the difference here is like we are very early on, but adoption is so pervasive so quick. And normally, you know, standards, you look at CVE, it's like that took many, many years, maybe even a decade to get to a point where people went from independently collecting vulns to the CVE program. And so, yeah, I think the challenge is we don't have the luxury with AI of long tail adoption.
Right.
It's here and it's now. So ultimately, like, yep, that's also going to be where threat actors spend some time exploring, you know. And I think the fact that you don't, a lot of times in these cases, you don't need lots of skills. Like you can use AI tools with AI tools, and you could use English language prompting to actually try and manipulate and do things as well. So
it's almost like an AI arms race to a certain extent, where it's like AI might help attackers do things a little bit more quickly with some pre-built tooling, and you know, just basically like less, like to your point, Patrick, less skill. But it's also important to note that products like Zafran and the things that you guys are doing on the back end to make that an easy to use product or an easy to use tool, where it's like they're not going to have to apply tons of critical thought, right? Like they can just do it. They can just like mitigate it. Like I think that's where this arms race is going between attackers and defenders, which is, yeah, sure, it's an enabling technology to a certain extent regarding AI, but it's also it's something that it's like, how do you use it, right? And how can you train LLMs to get to the point where it's just easier on the attacker side, right? And I think, Yonatan, you said that we're starting to see that, but it's also interesting to see where that's also an enabling technology for defenders, bringing that in to make it easier, right? Because like, what analyst, like there's not enough analysts anyway, but what analyst wants more complexity and, wants to put more time into a single thing to go and investigate that thing down the road?
Well, just upskilling. When you add all the different technologies, like the complexity of the environments that these people are working in, and we take somebody out of college, like they've never even turned on a Linux server before. Like they have no idea, right? Like they don't, and they're supposed to be coaching and working with their stakeholders on how to mitigate and remediate this. And like AI for defending against AI is so huge, and one of the areas that we don't talk about is upskilling the defenders, right? Like I can enable someone by asking just basic questions and using agentic to pull the telemetry from the environment to solve complex tasks that they're in no way near qualified to otherwise do. And I think that's really powerful. And part of the way that we're going to defend against the threat of AI is by enabling our defenders to be more powerful, more capable, more quickly.
Yeah, and I think there is another point about it. Like the race between defenders and attackers is going faster and faster. Like today, it takes 5 days for attackers to weaponize a vulnerability, and it takes 49 days to fix it for defenders. But like imagine a world when it can take just a few minutes to weaponize or to produce an efficient POC code. And half an hour to fix a vulnerability. So you have like two implications for that. First, like the race is going to be neurotic, and we all need like strong nerves to handle that issue. But like more seriously, we need to organize our defenses differently. Defenders have to be far more like time sensitive, far more automated, far more operational. It's not a marathon. It's like an endless series of like short sprints. So defending organization should be organized that way.
One thing I think I've been thinking a lot about, AI is going to be a catalyst for real change in organizations. And what I mean by that is like, when you think about how a traditional CTEM or vulnerability chain or process works, is that, I find it, I assess the risk, I communicate it, then my counterparts in a different organization are responsible for remediation. So we've really separated what our CEO likes to call the insights from the action, right? And I think what we are even starting to see with some of our customers is that like AI is going to enable security to be more embedded across the organization to take response actions. One of the most frustrating things about working or managing large vulnerability programs at big organizations is you can find them fast, you can assess the risk better than anybody, you're going to track all the metrics, but you can't fix them yourself, right? You're going to be measured against those metrics, but there's only so much you can do to affect them. And so like for me, that was a lot of the power of Zafran is like, I can use mitigations to actually reduce risk to the organization. Well, I think people are realizing based on the threat, but also based on the capability. And as we get more confidence with AI that, maybe we should let security address some of these issues. Like one of the things we do with Agentic is looking at a patch to understand whether it's going to create impact when deployed. So are there things that we can allow security to patch right now because they're not going to otherwise create impacts to the systems or applications within the environment? And so I think we'll start to see maybe some of that barrier break down because of the AI capability, but also because it's necessary to address the threat of AI. So I'm interested to see how that evolves over the next couple of years.
I love those points, and that's a great wrap up because you actually hit on my last question from the show notes already. So this has been awesome, guys. Nate Rawlings and Yonatan Keller, Zafran. I don't know, Patrick.
Thank
super
you.
cool company doing some
that
cool
was
stuff.
awesome.
Definitely a company to watch, and we'd love to get you guys back on here and continue the discussion. But thank you guys again, and what a great discussion for our listeners as well too. So that's our episode for today. Tune into our next episode, which we will be hitting episode number 10 in our next episode. So Patrick, we're like becoming famous right here. This is awesome. Well, thanks everybody for listening, and tune in for the next episode of ThreatCon 1, place to be to talk about emerging threats with the people who matter. Thank you guys.
Thank you.